All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening in Ukraine and in Russia. Let's start things off with what is going on the ground. We also have some news. Viktor Orban was giving a radio interview, and he said that the EU is talking about peacekeepers in Ukraine. An interesting revelation from Orban. We had Lukashenko. He gave a big speech, and he said that Poland was thinking and was considering invading Belarus. An interesting statement from Lukashenko, or starting a conflict with Belarus. An interesting statement from Lukashenko. We have Russian President Vladimir Putin dismissing, recalling the ambassadors, the Russian ambassadors in Latvia and Estonia. What does that mean? That's an interesting development as well. We have the Wall Street Journal alleged spy. That's an interesting development. And we have the Wall Street Journal now saying that the US should expel all Russian journalists and the Russian ambassador in the United States over this spy incident. One more thing, as we talk about the situation on the ground, to lead you into the situation on the ground, we do have Commander Sirski saying that in Bakhmut, he is starting to notice that the Wagner forces are weakening.
Yeah.
This is what Sirski said
Yes.
just this morning. So
Yes.
that leads you into the situation on the
Yes.
ground, and then I think you have a lot of stuff to talk about
Yeah,
on
here's
the
it.
geopolitical,
The geopolitical
political
thing.
end of things.
Yes, I mean, this is what Sirski is saying about the situation in Bakhmut, and of course, it echoes what Mark Milley was saying yesterday in the House of Representatives, so to the House Armed Services Committee, and we've had various reports about this, that the Wagner forces are weakening, and Mark Milley said that they'd made no progress at all in Bakhmut over the last 21 days, which, if you've been following the fighting in Bakhmut, is simply not the case. And in fact, shortly after Mark Milley said that, but before Sirski made his comment this morning, we got information which was confirmed by Ukrainian sources and accepted by even places like Reuters, that in fact the Russians have made further progress within Bakhmut itself. So I would take what Sirski says and what Mark Milley says very, very skeptically. Prigozhin himself has been talking. He says the major priority now is clearing Bakhmut, the town of Bakhmut. There's been lots of fighting going on in Bakhmut. The Russians are clearing Bakhmut steadily, incrementally. They've almost reached the city administration building. For myself, I see no evidence of any slackening of the Russian assault on Bakhmut, but it's clear there's a lot of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, and that's why the fighting there is so intense and why it is taking time to clear. If there's 10 or 20,000 Ukrainian troops fighting in Bakhmut, that's a lot of troops, and they can resist for a certain amount of time, for a long time. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Overall, in every other place, I gather along the battlefronts, I gather the weather has again taken a bad turn for the worse. There's more rain, things are more boggy. The Ukrainian offensive that we've been hearing so much about hasn't yet started. Suggestions now that it's going to be put back to the middle or late period of April. Who's to say? But, lots of talks, lots of discussions about that kind of thing. Now, all of these other things that are happening, I'm going to start first of all with the American journalist from the Wall Street Journal, because that's an important story, actually. Now, for me, the big clue as to what has happened is the location of this man's arrest. He was arrested in Yekaterinburg. Yekaterinburg is in the Urals. It's the biggest, I believe it's the biggest city in the Urals. It's a major industrial center. Yekaterinburg is right at the node, the central area of the Russian military industrial complex. The Urals is the major industrial center. If you're looking at the tank factories, The big tank factories are in Nizhny Tagil, which is quite close to Yekaterinburg, and in Omsk, which is also part of the Urals area. There's also a big industrial plant in Chelyabinsk, which was just visited by Shoigu, which makes shells. There is also a big plant in Perm, which makes aircraft engines. So what was this journalist doing in Yekaterinburg? He was probably asking questions about the state of Russia's arms industry. I think the Russians would interpret that as spying. Probably if a Russian journalist was doing the same in the United States, prowling around the Lima plant, for example, trying to find out what the state of US tank production is, he might also find himself in similar troubles. I'm just saying, I think that this person's been arrested. I think the most likely outcome of this is going to be expelled from Russia. I don't think it's going to be taken much further than that. There's going to be some discussion. Maybe the Russians will want to swap him with someone else. We will see. But that is what I think is going. I think this is going to be a contained affair. If the US wants to escalate it, they can do, and maybe they will do it. But if they start taking extreme steps, like expelling the ambassador, I think that is absolutely wild. I think that's bizarre. I think that will be a huge mistake. And I think it will be seen as such around the world. But, these people in Washington aren't very much in control of what they're doing. So I think an overambitious journalist asking too many questions in the wrong place, I think that's basically most likely the explanation for this story. And I think it will be contained. The other things are much more important. Talk in the EU of peacekeepers looks to me like some kind of way of cobbling together some kind of expeditionary force into Ukraine. An incredibly dangerous and bad idea. That's the first thing to say about that. The second is the talk from Lukashenko about a Polish attack on Belarus. That's also very ominous, and it might explain the Russian decision to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. It could be intended to deter Poland. And the expulsion of the two ambassadors from the Baltic states by the Russians is a further sign. I mean, of how bad the situation between Russia and these countries has now become. And it could be that the Russians are becoming concerned about what these particular diplomats are doing. So, what we are seeing is a further deterioration of the situation between the Russians and the Europeans in advance of this Ukrainian offensive that everybody knows is coming at some point over the next few weeks.
Yeah, okay, so let's see. Two questions. The first one with the journalist. We did a show on the Duran maybe like a month or two ago. I'm terrible with the timelines, but we said that after the whole Brittany Griner, Victor Boot thing, the U.S. State Department actually did begin arresting more Russian nationals.
Yes.
After that whole affair went down,
Yeah.
which was very embarrassing for the Biden White House, they continued to arrest Russian nationals. And we said at that program, at that time, we said, this is just going to continue to feed into this. We'll arrest your guy, you arrest our guy, and it's just going to keep on going back and forth. Do you think this may have been part of this arrest? This may have played a part in this arrest of the Wall Street Journal reporter?
Oh, absolutely.
I understand what you mean. He was probably asking the wrong questions at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
But the fact that the U.S. continues to arrest Russian nationals, do you think that kind of prompted the Russians to take a heavier hand instead of just expelling him? For example, just saying, okay, your visa's revoked, leave the country, you're blacklisted from Russia, and that's that, not making an international scene about it.
Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that the U.S. continued to arrest Russians played a part in this affair? And okay, answer that, and I'll give you the next question.
Yeah, I think the answer is absolutely, because once upon a time, so long ago, what the Russians would have done is exactly what you said. They'd have simply expelled this journalist. They would have simply said, you're expelled, you're not coming back, you've gone to the wrong place, you're asking the wrong questions, we're not prepared to tolerate that, and out you go. Instead, they've arrested him, and they are obviously holding him as part of a counter in further negotiations with the US about releasing their citizens of the United States, their citizens that the US is arresting, and of course, it's that sort of a game now. And an administration that goes on arresting Russians, an administration that encourages the ICC to issue arrest warrants against the Russian president, is inviting this kind of retaliation. Whether the US understands that, whether the administration understands that, I don't know. But it's inevitable. If you start going down that road, everybody else can start playing at this game.
Okay, going back to the spring offensive, Kaluba, the foreign minister, he gave an interview, I think to the Financial Times, if I remember correctly, and he said that if the spring offensive doesn't deliver the results that everyone's expecting, and if Ukraine doesn't get 100% of the territories that they're talking about taking, if it doesn't happen, they don't get 100% of the territories, and if the spring offensive maybe fails, he's like, just keep on sending weapons and money, and don't look at it as something to be discouraged about. It's just going to be. He was downplaying it. It's just going to be a spring offensive, and if it's successful or partly successful, or it fails, it really isn't going to determine the outcome of the war. That's pretty much what Kaluba was saying and what he was hinting at, and he made it a point to say, keep the money and the weapons coming, no matter what happens in the springtime. What do you make of that statement? I mean, he was really walking back claims that they have been making. They're the ones that talk about spending the summer in Crimea and sunbathing in Crimea and stuff like that.
Yes.
That's Zelensky that talks about these things. And now all of a sudden, it's, if it's not 100% successful, it's not a big deal.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly what it is. I mean, he's downplaying the results of the offensive, which suggests that more and more people in Kiev are beginning to have doubts about the extent to which it can achieve the very ambitious targets, objectives that it set itself, and he's trying to walk back this talk that there's been from Washington that this is the last-ditch offensive, that if it doesn't succeed, then it's game over in Ukraine. He wants the West to continue to commit to supporting Ukraine beyond the summer. So it suggests that he's having doubts and that the Ukrainians are having doubts about the success of this offensive. Well, I'm going to say what I think. If the offensive fails, then I think Kuleba is going to get what he wants. I think that the West now is so far up the escalation escalator that they don't have any real plan or idea about how to get off, at least not the leaders we see at the moment. So if the offensive fails, we could start to see further escalations. And perhaps that's what this talk about the peacekeeping force is all about.
Yeah. Okay, one final story to get to. Maybe we do a dedicated video on this when the meeting does happen in Beijing. Spanish Prime Minister is going to Beijing. Macron is going to Beijing. I believe Ursula is going to Beijing as well. I'm not certain if she's going, but I think she is. Anyway, she outlined her China doctrine, the EU China doctrine, yesterday. It's about de-risking and not decoupling from China, but she did issue a warning for China not to get too close to Russia. What do you make of her de-risking strategy? De-risking strategy is just weird, and her warning to China, to Beijing. Yeah, don't get too close to Russia.
Yeah, well, the Chinese will see the de-risking strategy as a bluff, because if she's talking about de-risking and saying we mustn't decouple, then that basically tells the Chinese that the Europeans are terrified of decoupling from China. And bear in mind what I've said, if you try and bluff the Chinese, they will always call your bluff. It's axiomatic. It's one of the first rules of diplomacy. That's the first thing to say. So it's a sign of weakness. And the second thing is her warning to China, the Chinese and the Russians, but the Chinese especially, have already made it clear. They've made this in public statements now. They've written it in their statements, the ones they've agreed with the Russians, which is that they will not brook interference, meddling, lectures, lessons, warnings from third parties about the relationship between China and Russia. So if Ursula or Charles Michel or whoever it is from the EU, who is eventually going to Beijing, comes along to Beijing and starts saying things like that to the Chinese will say, look, this is nothing to do with you. We have our relationship with the Russians. We value that relationship. We are not interested in what you say. Stay out. Keep your business out of this affair. Your hands out of this affair. It has nothing to do with you. If you value your relationship with us, you will not interfere in it.
Is Putin afraid for the safety of the ambassadors in Latvia and Estonia?
Yeah, very possibly. And I mean, I did think about that, and I don't want to discuss this in detail because there are dangers doing so. But I think that there are possibilities that he's generally worried that there might be risks to the diplomatic staff there, and that there might be, well, the kind of things that we saw happen in 1979 in Iran and that kind of thing.
Right. What would happen if Russia pulls out its embassies from Latvia and Estonia? What does that mean?
Well, it's
I mean, they've cut diplomatic ties then, in essence. I mean,
yeah, it does. It would mean a cutting of diplomatic ties. I don't know what it would mean, but it would put these two countries, I would have thought, in a very difficult situation, because it would mean that they're no longer in a position to talk directly to the Russians, who are, of course, there. They're big power next to them. It would confirm not just hostility, but the fact that Russia and these two little Baltic states are now in effect enemies. And if that is the situation, if I was a Baltic citizen, I would be very worried, because you have this giant on your doorstep, and that giant no longer sees you as a potential partner, but as an enemy. And I would be worried about, being squashed at some point. But, let's hope it doesn't come to that. Let's hope we don't see a complete rupture of diplomatic relations.
Yeah, Latvia has quite a significant Russian population, Russian diaspora.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. So does Estonia. Latvia. So does Estonia, by the way.
Estonia as well. I believe Latvia is something like 20% or something.
I think it's more than that. And I think in Riga, it's a lot more than that. And in Estonia, one of the towns, Narva, apparently regards the people there it's overwhelmingly Russian. The people think of themselves as Russian and are basically attached or feel themselves, detached from Russia. They don't want to be part of Estonia. So I understand. So I've heard from people, by the way, who've been there. But so it's risky. But of course, what Latvia is now saying is that unless Russian speakers, learn Latvian, I mean, I'm not absolutely sure about this report, by the way, but I saw a report yesterday that unless they learn to speak Latvian, they risk deportation from Latvia. And it could be that this was the final straw. If this is indeed what's happened, it could have been the final straw as far as Putin was concerned. And it could have decided him that this is impossible, that Russia can't continue to maintain diplomatic contacts at the highest level with governments that behave like that.
Yeah, there's some reason. Something tipped them off to dismiss those ambassadors, to get those ambassadors back home. Something happened. Yes. Or something was going to happen.
Yes. Yes. They're not all very ominous. The whole thing in Ukraine is looking very, very ugly and dangerous at the moment. We're all waiting for this offensive that Ukraine is going to launch. We're all going to wait and see what it achieves, if it achieves anything. And the situation is getting very ominous indeed. And of course, more people are dying all the time. And there's no sign that anybody in the West is prepared to talk peace. But I'm going to say something else. I think part of what we need to understand about all of these different moves is that the shadow of China is now hanging very heavy over this whole business. So that's one thing that has also, I think, raised the temperature, is that the Putin-Xi summit meeting has scared a lot of people.
Yeah, well, it woke them up because they were still under the belief that they could win China over, in much the same way they're under the belief that they can win India over, or they can continue to isolate Russia. They still have that belief that Russia is indeed isolated, and they're waking up to the fact that de-dollarization is going on. Russia is not isolated. India is very friendly with Russia. China is in a near alliance with Russia, even on a military level. Saudi Arabia is moving towards BRICS. I mean, all of these things hit the collective West in a matter of 1 or 2 weeks, and they've woken up to that, and they're freaking out.
Yes, that's exactly what they're doing. And as I said, this is worrying because, as I said, people who are becoming so nervous and frightened are capable of behaving in all kinds of erratic and irresponsible ways. I mean, I have to say the single most worrying thing for me is this peacekeeping idea that Orban is talking about. One wonders which countries, and one wonders also what is it that people are thinking about. I mean, one possibility, and one might want to think this, is that it could be that the EU is trying to cobble some kind of peace plan of its own, which calls for withdrawal of Russian troops and an insertion of EU peacekeepers in their place, possibly after a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think for the Russians, that's a non-starter.
You're saying the EU believes that Ukraine will have a successful offensive, and that's why they want to get the peacekeepers ready?
Yeah, they might be thinking in that way.
I would say maybe the reverse.
Yeah.
Can't you also say that they don't believe in a successful offensive, so maybe they want to throw in peacekeepers?
Actually, I incline very much to the second. I think this talk of a peacekeeping force, as I discussed before, isn't really about peacekeeping force. It's an attempt to try and create some kind of expeditionary force into Ukraine. You call it a peacekeeping force. I think this is far more likely. It's far more likely that they are becoming nervous that the Ukrainian offensive is going to fail. That is my own view. But I don't want to say, that the other possibility hasn't also occurred to me. I discount it. And if it is indeed what the Europeans are thinking, that some kind of a successful Ukrainian offensive leads to recapture of territory, and the EU is going to propose to the Russians an insertion of an EU peacekeeping force. I mean, that's a non-starter. The Russians will never buy into that. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, well, just a final question before we wrap up this video. Reznikov put out a statement, the defense minister of Ukraine put out a statement the other day, and he said that the spring offensive, contrary to what Kaluba said, he said the spring offensive is definitely happening. So please deliver us more tanks and weapons and ammo, artillery. That was his statement. I just don't understand one thing. How a spring offensive is coming in 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks? I don't know, 6 weeks? I don't understand. They're preparing the spring offensive. I mean, it is spring. Right now is spring. Yeah, I know, and you're asking for weapons? I mean, is it that simple? Deliver a tank today and tomorrow we're driving that tank through to Crimea? I mean, is that how all of this works?
Well, I mean, it's nonsense, and this is a military commander who's talking this nonsense because, in effect, what he's saying is, I don't have enough weapons to carry out this spring offensive. Now, I mean, I am not able to try and unpack the logic of this. It could be you again want to take a sort of Machiavellian view. This is a disinformation exercise. It's intended to lull the Russians into complacency, Ukraine admitting that it doesn't have enough weapons. I think it's much more likely that Syrskyi, like Kaleba, are preparing for the failure of this spring offensive and that they're going to turn around to the West after it fails, or at least it fails to achieve the objectives they've set, and say that the reason it didn't succeed was because we didn't have enough weapons. So it wasn't our fault, it was your fault, and therefore send us even more.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, let's leave it there.
Yeah, it is.
Look,
this is the
crazy.
maddest, the craziest war I've ever known. I mean, not from the Russian side. The Russians, they're waging war in a conventional way, but on the Western and Ukrainian side, it's getting weirder and madder almost by the day.
All right, the Duran.locals.com. We are on Rockfin and Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and Telegram. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.